I was looking at some story that showed that, like, depending on where you are, people don't fly direct to some places in the Middle East because they don't want to fly over some countries, right? And so what could have been a 20-minute flight is an hour and a half flight or a 2-hour flight, right?
Yeah. Oh, that's one the passport stamp and also yeah. Sign.
What's the date today?
We're doing it at
7th.
And then okay. Wow, there's all around. Can someone please take the cheddar scribe seat or just do cheddar? Cheddar is the easier one.
There's always that.
Who was that?
Does anybody have a Jabber client anymore? I mean, have Jabber anymore.
We say go ahead. And then we do need someone to take notes.
I can remember those.
Thank you, Lee.
Thank you, Lee. Tony's not here. I volunteer him.
Good luck with that.
Works every time for me.
Well, I guess that has worked, and then we get updates.
All right.
Welcome, everybody. Usual note well. We got it all one slide. Got our blue sheets, got our note taker, we got our Jabber client. Here's our proposed agenda. Anybody have any comments on the agenda? Going once.
So basically, we have 3 documents in flight. We're going to talk about all 3 of them and to see where we're going from here.
Okay, if not, Annabelle?
Okay, subject, do I get a clicker?
Does it work?
I haven't tried that.
It does.
Okay.
All right. Cool. So security, subject identifiers for security event tokens. Quick refresher of what we are talking about here. There are use cases we've seen with Secevent sets and events where we want to express a variety of types of subjects within the context of the same event, or identify a subject in a variety of ways. So we need ways to disambiguate between, are we identifying a subject by an email? Are we identifying them by a phone number? And in some cases, that identifier is more than one value. Like it's an issuer and subject, which might be different from the issuer of the token itself. Or we need to have some additional metadata in there explaining how to interpret the value if we're talking token hashes. So here we are. The solution this spec provides is defining subject identifier types. It's a schema that explains how to express a subject identifier and what the properties in that identifier mean. The document currently declares 4 different subject identifier types, and it defines an IANA registry for the types and their definitions. Along with the type, we're then defining a subject identifier as a JSON object. Subject identifier has a type. That goes back to one of these. And then the JSON object contains claims based on what is defined by the subject identifier type. So example is helpful. Here's an example event from Risk, is the account disabled event. The bolded part there is the part that's coming from this specification. Here, the Risk definition for account disabled says that it has a subject claim in its payload, and the type of that subject claim is a subject identifier. In this case, it's a subject identifier using the issuer and subject type. Where are we at with this? We just put out O2 right before cutoff for this meeting. We've got use cases for in risk. I'm not aware of anybody else who's talked about adopting this. There's been some people saying, hey, this is a good idea, but I'm not aware of anybody else, any other specs that are going in and putting it in. And then Google and Amazon both have implementations for this in progress as part of the work we're doing for risk. So big change from 0 to 02 was we added semantics for each of these subject identifier types. That was the big feedback in Montreal, was we should be clear on what these mean. So I took a stab at that. Not sure I like the values I provided, so I kind of want to go over that here with everybody and get some more feedback on those. So let's look at this. If you look at the document, I left one of the types off here, ID token claim, and we'll get to that later. But if we focus on email, phone, and issuer subject as 3 of the types defined in the document, if you look at the document, this is what it provides as the meaning for each of those. It's just kind of user account oriented definition. I did get some feedback offline that that's probably too specific. So I want to throw an alternative text out here for each of these and see what people think about that. So here we're kind of dropping the whole idea of this being specifically about user accounts, and we're talking about kind of how does the email and how does the phone value relate to the thing we're trying to identify. So it's a little bit different way of approaching the definition. So before I move on from this, anybody have thoughts or comments on what we're doing here? Preferences between the two? Are either of them going in the right direction?
A question about phone. I mean, I can sort of, sorry, Leif Johansson, so that I can sort of see the semantic of email because that's how you typically use email for account recovery. But do you use phone in the same way, right? And what does communication mean in this way? Are we in this sense, right? Are we talking about SMS, phone calls, what, right? The semantic doesn't seem as clear for phone as it does for email.
Okay.
Ben Kaduk. So, I mean, one less obvious aspect of transitioning from referring to users to things you communicate with is that you could potentially be going from talking to a unique individual to talking to a group or a member of the group, and you might not know which member. And that's not necessarily bad. I just wanted to point out that there is a subtle semantic change.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. I think you're missing one of the key identifiers, which is there's a URI prefix ACCT for account that's used, among other things, in OpenID Connect Discovery, WebFinger, and other things. And you have plenty of account identifiers that are not email addresses. So for instance, I'm self-issued at Twitter. You know, there may be an email address associated with it, but that's not the primary key.
Did you have any feedback on these semantics though, Mike?
Yeah, account overlaps with your definition of email, and you should probably replace email with account, or at least have a clear differentiation.
Why is that? Because
you can't represent in any of those types a pure username where that's important.
So are you suggesting that, it sounds like you're suggesting that we should be able to use email to represent, say, I am at so-and-so at Twitter?
No,
Or-
I'm suggesting you add a type,
Add a type,
ACCT,
Okay.
which is, and I can send you the RFC number, a such and such account identifier.
Okay. So that would be a separate type? So do you have
Right.
any comments on the semantics that are proposed for these?
Yeah.
It sounded like when you started out talking, you were critiquing that. So I want to make sure we have your
Yeah. Email and phone are often used to represent an entity that might be a company as opposed to a user.
Understood.
Yeah.
And those are probably, necessary. I'm saying that there will be events about accounts.
I know that's but we're on the slide here around semantics. So I'm trying to focus conversation, playing the chair, focusing on feedback on this slide, which is the semantics.
I will want to read the draft about what the representations of phone and email are. The semantics as is probably close enough.
In the last
In particular, is phone canonicalized?
phone is canonicalized as E164. Yeah.
Okay.
So focusing our conversation at the last meeting, there was questions as to what were the semantics of these particular identifiers. And so Annabelle's working to have semantics for these ones. Right.
I think there's one thing I want to point out about the difference between these two, which I think is important. And it goes to the idea of the subject potentially being a person or an organization. What's in the spec, what's in the draft right now is kind of defining the actual subject itself as this is a user account. The proposed text shifts what we're defining. We're no longer being specific about the nature of the subject, but we're instead talking about how do these identifiers, how do these values relate to that subject, which is a bit of a different shift. So
I liked the word identified in the previous slide better. So go back to the current slide. I would change it to subject that is identified with the specified email address and subject that is identified with the specified phone number. That mirrors the audience language in JOT and SAML, where you're saying an entity that's identified with such and such an audience. I'll write it up. Thank you.
yeah, happy to get the feedback. One thing I think I was trying to capture with this with communicated, and we can discuss on list if this is the right idea, is that email and phone should be actual functional email address and phone number, not something that is just formatted to look like one. That's the intention here. If there's better language to use for that, happy to get feedback on that and change that. But that's the intent behind the use of communicated there. Message received.
Ben Kadek, at risk of Dick chewing me out, I just want to clarify real quick from Mike. When you first got up, I thought you were saying that the account type would replace the email type, and now it sounds like you're thinking it would be a different thing. Okay, thanks.
You're on Schiffer. So a few
And I wouldn't
things.
chew you out.
First, I think the original semantic definitions are much more specific, much more concrete. And so whether they're correct or not, they actually define semantics, whereas the new stuff is just wishy-washy in my mind. And then to the Twitter thing, I think that would be covered by issuer subject. So I don't think, why not? Why not Twitter as the issuer and subject as self-issued?
Twitter doesn't use ID tokens.
Okay, got
Well,
it.
they don't today.
So-
But
so-
if they did, you could represent a Twitter subject with Twitter as being the issuer and the subject being the Twitter handle.
So I agree, given that some people actually use Twitter for account verification, specifically Keybase does that, I think we need something that would cover that sort of thing. And then on the bigger question, a few slides ago, you had uniquely identifies. I don't think the identifier should uniquely identify a subject. And that's actually a key point. Dick and I talked about
Mhm.
it. I gave the example of I'm giving my wife's
Yeah.
phone number as verification or secondary or tertiary verification for my account. You should be sending all of my identifiers, but some of them may not be unique to me, and that's fine. And the receiver will decide what to do with them.
I think that's right. I think unique is probably needs to be removed from that. I'm seeing Torsten shaking his head though. So let's argue.
Yes.com. So please don't remove that because an identifier needs to be unique. And I did so. Torsten Lodderstedt, yes.com. You're welcome. The example you just gave with the recovery email address is a good example why an email address can function as an identifier or as an address. In case of a recovery, it's used as an address. It doesn't uniquely identifies your account. You typically use the email address as an identifier in a way that's unique. So you can have implementations where a user account is identified by email address, and the same address can be shared among user accounts for account recovery. That's not a contradiction. So please, I would opt for keeping the uniquely identifies. Can we go to the slide that we would like to discuss? Can you go one back?
This
So
is
I
what's
think-
currently in there.
Yeah, that's the old definition is from my perspective much too specific because an email is not the user account in my mental model. It's an alias, something that identifies user account. So that's yeah.
Maybe we take the word user out of there.
No, the text says the email. I read the text. Email is a user account associated with an email address, and that's not how I would express that. It's my opinion. You don't have to agree necessarily. So and if you go to the next slide, from my perspective, you have taken two steps, not one. So I agree with Mike. I would state that the email address identifies a user account. And then since you want to express something more about what the email address, about your assumptions around the email address, so your assumption is that the email address not only identifies the subject, but it's also an address you can use to communicate with the account holder. And I think that's both valuable to have. Okay.
So going back to the uniqueness thing and responding to what Torsten just said, in the use case that I have in mind around account takeover kind of things, even if this is not a unique identifier, but it may have been used to break into an account, the receiver still wants to know about it. So maybe it was broken into, maybe it wasn't. It's not always possible to know, but I think we need to have as much information as possible conveyed in this message. So both unique identifiers and stuff that may not be unique.
They are all globally unique identifiers, right?
Yeah,
As
well,
opposed to
an email address is globally unique, of course.
But the difference is they're not necessarily unique for the subject.
Yes.
Okay, so it sounds like that's something we want to take up on the list and get broader feedback on, sort of unique or not, and then also the question of the semantics. I like the idea of it bringing identified by back into it. I think that's appropriate. Identified with, yes. Yeah, happy to receive some text for that, and cool, great. All right, let's move on. So, you recall I said I left off one of the types for that on the semantic slides. That type is ID token claims. The use case for this type is where we have a OpenID Connect client that could be using any of issuer subject or phone number or email as the claims that they understand. They're receiving an ID token from an OP. And while we would like them to be always using issuer and subject, they might not be. They might just be matching based on email address. So how do we communicate with that client if we don't necessarily know what which of the identifiers we've given them they're actually using? So the ID token claims approach for that is to create this sort of combination type where you can have issuer and subject and email and phone number, any combination of the three of those. The few problems with this. One is it makes the semantics of that really weird. Like you sort of have to start defining it as, well, in the case where this claim exists, then it means this or it means that. It's also duplicating definitions for other types. Now you've got definitions for an email claim in a subject identifier type, kind of in both places, both in the email type and in the ID token claims type. And it's arguably too limited in that you can't use it to express that you have multiple emails for the same subject or multiple phone numbers for the same subject. You're locked into one of each of those possible types. So alternative that I am proposing here is an aliases type, which is basically a container for a list of subject identifier types. Excuse me, a list of subject identifiers. So instead of having this kind of strictly defined in terms of which types it can contain, this is arbitrary. You can put any number of different subject identifiers of different types in it. The constraint is that they all have to resolve to the same subject. They've all got to be identifying the same subject. Advantages, we have a lot more flexibility here. The semantics are a lot clearer. We're reusing types that get defined elsewhere, and we can automatically start using types, new types as they are defined elsewhere. And it does this without introducing anything complicated for people who don't need to care about it. If you don't care about aliases, then you just ignore it. So an example of what this could look like is here. Here we're just showing the subject type. We're not showing the set event definition around it. It just has an aliases claim, which is a list, and within the list you have different subject identifiers. In this case, an issuer subject and email. Do we have?
No, I don't think so.
Does anyone know how to make it work? You do hit the button, see?
The red button?
Yeah, red.
Justin, just yell real loud.
All right. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, cool. So I didn't stay up late for nothing. All right. So anyway, I had a question about this aliases construct. What I was wondering about this is that this is getting a little bit too into the weeds of the semantic of the term aliases, but to me that implies that there is a primary identifier and then a set of secondary, tertiary, et cetera, and so forth. That there's some sort of preferred order of dereferencing that I should be doing to all of these identifiers. Is that what you intended here? And if not, how do you propose to support that when somebody inevitably asks for it?
So the intention here isn't to try and express or enforce a particular hierarchy of identifiers. The reason I chose the word aliases is because it makes it clear, to my mind at least, that all of these identify the same thing. That this isn't something where you can throw a bunch of identifiers in for a bunch of different subjects and all of a sudden you have a batch security event token. Like, it doesn't work like that.
Right.
So I wanted to avoid that confusion.
Yeah, that particular semantic is really good, and I think that that's very important that this all wraps down to the same person or entity, whatever. But what came to mind is, could this instead be a parameter that's added to all subject types? So basically, along with subject type, you have aliases, which is other subjects, as opposed to it being its own subject type.
I see. So you have kind of the primary
Right.
subject identifier, and within that, you potentially have a list of other identifiers that might apply to it.
Right.
Yeah,
And- And ultimately, this may be solving a problem that nobody has. It's just that my experience with how systems like this tend to get put together, there is usually that here's a thing and here's a bunch of other ways to talk about it, as opposed to here's a bunch of ways to talk about the same thing.
In the OpenID Connect, though, it sort of provides a number of identifiers. I mean, the background on this has got driven by OpenID Connect, where the relying party got a number of identifiers, and you don't know which one they chose to use as their primary key. And now you're trying to say, send them all the same identifiers again, so they can pick the one that they've been using as their primary key to go and talk about the same subject.
Okay.
And so there isn't a primary there. They're all primaries in that particular example.
Okay,
You could-
that makes sense for driving this style of data structure. I can get that and accept that. I was, like I said at the beginning, I was tripping over the word aliases. Naming things is hard. That's fine. Ben's got a bunch of alternatives, including alternatives, in the chat log here. So if we do accept this, I think we will want to be very careful in how we hammer the name, just so that it doesn't imply something that we're not intending.
Right. Yeah, happy to workshop on the name. It sounds like you said there are suggestions placed in Jabber.
Yeah, so Ben did alternatives, equivalents, and options.
Okay.
As just, I'm assuming just kind of spitballs. Those all still read kind of similar to me, but naming things is hard.
Yep. Leaf, can you make sure that you got those alternatives in the notes?
Right?
Perfect. Cool. Just want to make sure we have
Totally
those.
agree with the semantics. Thank you.
Yeah. So yeah, happy to workshop on the name. It doesn't sound like or look like there's opposition to the idea. I'm not seeing anybody rushing to the mic to tell me I'm crazy. So there were three alternate names that were pasted. So Ben, did you say you'll email them?
Brett Jordan. Aliases I'm fine with. I think it's pretty easy to understand, and when it's just an alias for something like at the top level, these are the various other things. If you're going to start referencing things that might exist elsewhere, or an external references concept is maybe a little more appropriate.
Thank you. Okay, no other comments on that. Then we can move on to the last thing I want to talk about for subject identifiers, which is canonicalization. Mike mentioned this dirty word earlier. We have a canonicalization for phone numbers in there because we're specifying the format. That's very restrictive. The text does not say anything about email canonicalization today. It just says it has to match an address spec from whichever RFC defines that these days. So it's not...
it needs to be a valid email address, which is different than a canonical.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it needs to match the format of an email address. That's all that's in there today. So the question is that fine? Do we just kind of punt on that whole conversation? Do we need to explicitly say we're not canonicalizing, or do we need to open the can of worms and give some strict canonicalization rules?
Lucy Lynch, so from the earlier slides and looking at the subject use of the email, it appears that this could be used for a role-based account, in which case these would not be canonical.
Could you...
Can you elaborate on that?
So abuse at may be owned by multiple people in a company. Abuse at may also be a dead end. It may go to a ticket system no longer monitored.
So if I understand your comment correctly, the email address itself may not be a canonical identifier for a mailbox, or it may be a
Particularly in
list,
case
it may
where you
be
believe
a dead
it's
end.
reachability of a subject.
I think the concern, the way I'm focusing on canonicalization here is around sort of the canonicalizing the expression of the email address. So that may or may not matter depending on what problem we're trying to solve or how specific we want to get here. Mike.
Email address is a term that you need to better specify, at least in the draft. For instance, RFC 821 defines a bunch of valid email address syntaxes, one of which would be the string dick space, heart space, left angle bracket, dick at amazon.com, right angle bracket. That's a valid email address. I don't think it's what you mean.
The draft currently specifies that it's an address spec from
821.
that are
Okay.
821.
Or-
So
or
that's the part in
okay.
between the angle brackets.
Okay.
At least that's what I was trying to capture. So
And
if that's wrong,
I think
give
that's
feedback,
right.
but yeah.
And I think the only thing you could canonicalize is to lowercase the host name. You can't touch the part before the @ sign. Whether that's useful to do, I don't know. But in the spec, email addresses before the @ sign are case sensitive.
Well, if I could just jump in. So most production systems now will do some kind of canonicalization of whatever the user entered in so that it turns into the same string. When you go to log in, right, I could type capital D, dick.H, heart@gmail.com, or all lowercase dickhart@gmail.com. I can change the caps, and systems will all figure out that most systems will canonicalize that into the same set of characters independent of how I've typed it in.
And indeed, if the canonicalization is done at the hosting entity using its rules, that's okay. If you try to impose sort of general rules, you're
if I could just
running down a rat hole.
So in production, that's what people do. And so there's not a canonical email format because people do different canonicalizations in production. And so when you're getting a set that has a subject in it, how that other system canonicalized and how you canonicalize may not be the same. And so you'll need to canonicalize the subject you got and then use that canonicalized string to search your system to find the same subject.
Is it in the draft?
Is what in the draft?
No, there's no discussion. There's no discussion.
Yeah, there's no discussion. Yeah, maybe this is just a non-normative
description.
Yeah.
Right. The question is, should we try to specify canonicalization? And I wanted to bring that up so that we don't have that on the list. It's good that, well, we can have it on a list. It's a good topic to discuss here and see if there's anyone that's interested in doing canonicalization.
Mike, I would be interested in, Dick, you as an individual contributor, writing a paragraph saying what you just said to put non-normatively in the draft so
Sure.
we can refer to it.
Yeah, but the question I wanted to see was whether people wanted to do canonicalization. I'm happy to write the comment saying why we didn't, or what you should do to use it.
I think it's impossible.
So
Well,
Ben Kaduk,
yes.
There be dragons, and whether or not you talk about them or not, they're still there. So there's
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word you said, Ben.
there be dragons.
Oh, yes, yes.
And so, there's several different aspects. I mean, some of you sort of touched on already how, there might be a single authoritative issuer who, generates the initial email address. And if JSON and JOT were reliable, carriers for opaque byte strings, that might be okay. And you could just use that one authoritative value. We've had plenty of discussion about canonicalizing JSON on many lists, so I don't feel a need to replicate that. But that's not the only potential issue. So if we look at, RFC 5321 or 5322, which are the latest core email related stuff, they've got some ABNF definitions for the adder spec local part at domain. And when you get into the domain, well, now you're talking about domain names, and you've got internationalization considerations. You've got internationalized domain names, and there's plenty of confusability and canonicalization issues there, and it's not really in scope for us to try and nail down exactly all of the semantics for all of that. That's the topic for other working groups, but we definitely need to say something that there are concerns here, and you need to be careful what you do. And there's potentially not even IETF consensus on what the right thing to do is. So we can't really offer super concrete guidance.
So another vote in favor of some non-normative text.
So, so with my chair hat on, I'd like to focus the discussion. I think so far there's consensus that this is a can of worms that we would like to avoid. My question to the room, and maybe on the list, is whether this is really, really important to anybody, and specifically whether people think that if we don't add a hashing of addresses as an option, this is not going to fly. This is useless. Otherwise,
Just a slide on hashing that.
yeah. So we'll get there. Otherwise, I think we just don't want to go there.
Did I put it in?
Yeah, there's a hash.
Okay.
Brett Jordan. Yeah, I think there's always issues when we deal with canonicalization of either data or the structure. But that's part of the reason why we have a broken internet, is because working groups aren't willing to pay the cost to figure these things out, do it. We just continually, over the past 30 years that I've been involved, just keep punting it. And so that's why everything's broken. And so I think there would need to be some care and diligence done here, especially if we ever want any of this stuff digitally signed. Because if people are just going to put in random things, then you have no way to replicate or reproduce. You basically actually have to keep the entire byte stream of the original data so that you could ever, so it's a little soapbox of mine, but I think when possible, we should do specificity.
So what are you suggesting we do? Are you saying that this working group should tackle email canonicalization?
I'm not saying that we should tackle it for the entire IETF, but I think for this specific use case in this specific property, we could potentially give some guidance. Maybe it is non-normative text, but at least start righting the ship out of being broken.
Mike Jones, as a point of clarification to your point about if you're going to sign it, you have to keep the whole signing input around. These fields are in a JOT, which do exactly that. So we've already solved that problem in the JOT spec, which is 7519.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we've got some non-normative text to explore on the list. Doesn't sound like there's much support behind actually trying to solve this here. Yeah, see, I don't.
You don't?
Yeah.
That's it?
Yeah, I can talk about the email hash thing.
Okay. Yeah.
So yeah, something
I thought I read it. I
No.
thought I read a slide with that.
we talked about it. Yeah. So one thing that kind of potentially throws a wrench into the works here is something we've talked about in the working group, but is not in the draft currently, is a email hash or phone number hash identifier type. This is something that services might want to use if they are trying to exchange events with a party where they don't know if they have a shared account or not, but they think they might. So if it's, say it's Amazon and Facebook, we might want to send a hash of an email address. So if Facebook has an account for that email address, they can recognize that. If they don't, we're not giving them a real customer's email address. Obviously, if you're going to hash stuff, it makes it really hard to do that if you don't have a canonical form for that, or if you don't have, if both sides aren't structuring that the same way. So I'm not convinced necessarily that means we have to do canonicalization, but it definitely complicates matters.
That was exactly my point.
It's possible that's something that could be solved within the context of the email hash identifier type, though.
Ben Kadek, I guess the hashing is sort of the most simple thing you could do as sort of a privacy protection, and there may be more complicated things that offer slightly better guarantees. What I actually came up to the mic to say was sort of a more generic question about the document as a whole, and it may just be that I forgot since Montreal because there've been too much other stuff going on. But the examples that you presented had the subject identity type associate, like present alongside the actual subject values. And I couldn't remember if there were cases that you had in mind where you would be conveying just the type without the actual identity.
Or where you would just be specifying, like, I have a phone number or I have an email address without actually providing the email claim.
Right. Like, I want you to send me some identity and I want you to use this type, that sort of thing.
I can think of a use case in Risk where that has come up in discussion. I don't think it impacts the structure of the subject identifier, though. I think for that, we would probably just have a list of subject identifier types.
All right, thanks.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on subject identifiers before we move on?
This is Brian Campbell with Ping Identity. I read the draft finally.
Yay!
One thing I was a bit surprised not to find in there was an actual defined claim for a subject identifier type. Like in all the examples you have subject colon blah 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 blah.
Right.
And I went into it expecting to find that, and I didn't find it. And I was wondering if there's an explicit reason for not defining a specific claim for it.
So the subject claim within the subject identifier is defined in the draft. What is not defined is like a JOT claim for a subject identifier.
Correct. And the latter is what I sort of anticipated finding and didn't.
Right. Part of that, I think, comes from the context where we're doing this. We're we're assuming that that's going to be provided as part of the definition for the event payload, and that's defined by whichever specs are defining events. If you think there's value in defining a subject identifier claim, a JOT level claim, we can talk about that. There's obvious concerns around how that plays with existing issuer sub and how we work with that. But I think that's maybe worth bringing up on the list.
Okay.
Yeah. One of the, in Risk, we were also looking at using the subject as to how do you signal which subject you'd like to subscribe to things. So it's not used in an actual
In a
set.
JOT context.
It's used in a different context, but you want to have that same way of representing, identifying a subject in a subscription command as you may have in an actual set.
That makes sense. I was looking to sort of prematurely maybe use it in an example and use it in another context, and got to the point where I needed to put it in a claim, and then thought, well, oh man, what do I call this? And so I'm not sure if it makes sense to standardize it or not, but yeah, I can raise the question. And even if we don't, I suppose it might be helpful to have some wording, some advice towards usage outside of the
But
Risk.
isn't the subject claim in the
it doesn't
set,
work.
right? Set defines a subject claim, and then this says what you put into there.
Does it? I don't think so. It does.
Set defines a subject claim. I think that leaves it up to the events to define that in the event payload. I think it says that events should define that if it's different from the subject in the of the set, but it doesn't go into any more prescription than that. I could certainly see value in standardizing on a subject identifier alternative claim to sub.
Yeah.
And yeah, that this might be the right document for that. If there's people who are, if you're looking at use cases where you want to be able to get going with that, then maybe now's the time to do it. So yeah, I'd be happy to discuss that further.
Okay. Yeah, maybe I'll raise the question on the list. I'm not sure. Okay. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, on to number 2. Hi, I haven't gone anywhere. Push-based set token delivery using HTTP. New topic, new draft. Quick refresher on what we're talking about here. We are talking about how to get sets from one entity to another. That's with push-based set token delivery using HTTP. We are doing that by having a transmitter make a set transmission request. What are you doing with my slides?
There we go.
Thank you. A transmitter makes a set transmission request to the event recipient. The request body is the set itself. Content type is application Secevent JOT. That's pretty much all there is to it from the transmitter side. The recipient, if it's successful, if they parse the set, if they like it, they send back a 202 accepted. If not, if they have a problem, then they send back an error object that contains an error code and a description with a 400 HTTP status code. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We are now on version 3 of this. We've got implementations in the works between Google and Amazon.
Those were for risk.
Yes, those are part of the work we're doing for risk. So how do we get from 1 to 3? What do we do there? If you recall, this came out of the split from the combined HTTP delivery draft that we were discussing a couple of meetings ago. This is further iterating on it after that split. I rewrote the abstract introduction and some of the technical description to make a little bit more sense now that we're just talking about one protocol at a time. Pulled out a bunch of content that wasn't necessary, wasn't really contributing, a lot of non-normative stuff. Made some minor corrections, and we added the IANA registry for error codes, which was one of the big pieces of feedback that we got. So one of the concerns people had about splitting the draft was duplication of content between the two. Were we going to have a whole bunch of content that was the same between 2 different drafts? Where we sit with that now, there's still some duplication, but it is much less than it was. Currently, both documents have basically the same definition section. They both define this error and code and description structure, and then they have some overlap in security and privacy considerations. All of these look to me like things where we can just have pull, reference, push, and be done with it, and eliminate that duplication. We may or may not be able to do that with the failure response structure. It depends on, I think Mike has a pending edit of the pull protocol description, and so it may or may not fit in there well. We'll see how that turns out. So open item. Something that came out in our discussion between editors is that our list of error codes currently in the draft aren't very well defined. There's about 12 of them, and it's not clear. They're not very well differentiated from one another. So you have scenarios where it's not clear what kind of error code you should be sending back. It could be one, it could be another. The other interesting thing about these is they are mostly JOT errors. If you look at the error codes, almost all of them relate to processing of JOTs, validating signatures, decrypting JWEs, that sort of thing. So they're not set focused. So just to kind of give an example of what I mean by that. So here's the current set of error codes. Of these, only 3 of them really relate to something that's specific to set. The rest are all JOT related or basic syntax related. I did take a stab at, like, if I were to revise these and come up with more specific, clearer error codes, what would that look like? And even when I did that, I ended up with almost entirely error codes that are related to JOTs. So that leads to a number of questions. Is there an existing list of JOT error codes we can reference instead? I'm not aware of one, but I'd happily learn about one if it exists. Mike's shaking his head no. If there isn't, then is this the right place for us to standardize that? Is this document the right place? Is Secevent the right place? Do we reopen Jose and punt that work over there? Want to get the group's sense on that.
Yaron Scheffer, this kind of looks like bike shedding to me. I think we need to define a few error codes. I don't much care whether they are the existing ones or the ones you propose. And we just need to make sure that they're generally applicable, so most people who implement reasonable parsers will be able to make sense of them. And speaking of bike shedding, I think we need to add a language tag to the description. So lang :en and then description. But not go all the way to allow multiple strings in different languages and all that sort of stuff. I think RFC, whatever it is, says that we need to have a language tag, and we do.
Mike Jones, Microsoft. To the extent that we think that we've sliced the error space so finely that different implementers would use different ones for the same condition, that tells me we should probably collapse the number into a smaller set of more general ones, unless the distinctions are actually really semantically important. So I'll at least try to review the draft with that in mind.
I think currently there's overlapping definitions, and so it may be sufficient for us to just tease those apart and clarify and draw that line between error codes a little bit better. The question still goes, if we're talking about JOT errors, is this the right place to do that? So do people have reservations about us defining that within set or within Secevent, excuse me?
There will be an error space used for this protocol. So some of those errors will be about JOTs, some will not. But it's fine for us to define our own error space. That doesn't mean that other groups would necessarily want to or have to use those when the errors are about JOTs. So I think that's just a different thing that we don't need to concern about ourselves. We're in a particular scope. Let's build an error space that works for that scope.
So part of why I want to bring that up is implementation-wise, people are going to be building this stuff on JOT parsers that are going to be written a certain way. There's potential value if those parsers are emitting a common set of errors that can just be forwarded on. If not, then that forces the implementer to kind of map between whatever errors their parser is generating and whatever errors the particular protocol requires in this case.
Since you're talking about parsers, there's at least dozens and probably hundreds in existence at this point. We're not going to be able to reach inside them and get them to differentiate between different kinds of errors if our spec requires it.
As I actually have one of those parsers, and just from experience, because there was no defined sort of error space for it, mine, and I think a pretty significant number of them, will just fail. jot not well, jot not parsable, and not
Yeah,
necessarily give you easy programmatic
Mhm,
access
mhm,
to the
mhm.
reasons for failure.
Mhm.
I've since sort of retrofitted it for certain conditions that specific implementers were looking for,
Mhm.
but I do think you'll struggle in this space to find implementations
Mhm.
that can do an easy mapping.
Mhm.
So something to consider.
So
I
just
also
to
think
dig
it's
into that, Brian, you're saying that you don't provide any fidelity as to why it failed. It could be that it was bad JSON, could be that it was a bad missing piece, or do you?
So originally I provided quite a bit of fidelity, but it's human readable fidelity
Mhm.
intended more at a developer who is there to be able to figure out what the hell is going on.
Right.
But there was no programmatic fidelity that a library might
Right.
look for specific error codes and map that to something or take some retry action. I have since tried to retrofit a little of that where possible, but how I did that's probably different than how somebody else did it, whether they did it at all. That's just some context around the space of what's there.
So do you have an opinion on, do we have too much fidelity in the errors we have now, or?
So to be honest, I haven't actually looked at the specific errors. But my sense, just a general perspective, is probably yes. And I think that for a protocol, in at least the error codes, the only real reason to have differential error codes is if the application can take some meaningful action off of the error code. Otherwise, you want to have something available like a description field that'll help a developer during the development and bugging phase know what's going on. But it doesn't have to be as I'm struggling for the word, static or defined in the error code. Just something they can read, but not necessarily that an application.
The description field is sufficient for that.
Sufficient for that kind of thing. So I would tend towards more general error codes and with I know
So not needing the fidelity in the error code, having the fidelity in the description, right?
Generally speaking, yes. Unless there's a well understood case for why the fidelity would be necessary at application runtime.
Right.
Which is a hard question to answer, but you can have a sense of it, I think.
Okay, thanks.
Just some thoughts.
I mean, the thing that we try to avoid is, a number of security related things that just says wrong, and you don't know which of the 12 mistakes you might have made was the one you made, right?
And that's the risk of leaving it up to the description is, the developer likely just copies whatever description was in the example that was given in the spec, and they don't bother to customize it, and then that leads to very hard to debug integrations.
Ben Kaduk, I think Brian already said most of what I was going to say, but you had asked the question of, is Secevent the right place to define these sort of generic jot errors, or would there be a different working group or an IAN registry or something like that? And it really seems like the motivation for trying to go into that broader scope and get a broader consensus on these definitions would only be relevant if we had some interoperability need for their usage. And to a large extent, there isn't going to be any automatable or mechanical actions that you can take based on receiving these error codes. And so once you're getting a human involved, there's a lot less need for a uniform agreement on what the values are.
So to summarize what you're saying, Ben, is we should just define them here in this working group for what we need to help our protocol, and that
I don't see a reason
reuse
to
of
do
it
anything
across
else.
other working groups doesn't seem as useful because you're not trying to interop between the different protocols.
2 points related to this, Mike Jones. One, the JOT spec, for better or for worse, is absolutely full of language of the form, if condition is not true, then the JOT must be rejected. It says nothing about what a library would return to a caller. So there are no error definitions at all. With respect to error codes versus error descriptions, I think OAuth kind of got this right, that there's a small set of codes intended to be consumed by programs, and there's an open text field to be used to communicate to application developers what you think happened.
Okay, so it sounds like the one place where interop could potentially be valuable, the library layer, the ship has long since sailed on any benefit there. We'll go back and look at the existing list of error codes, see if we can resolve the ambiguities and propose a new list with probably less fidelity than what's there now.
Yeah, just want to poke at what you're suggesting. Mike, were you suggesting we do what we did with OAuth, where we have an error code and then we have a description field and the developer puts whatever they want in there? We don't specify what's in that description field. We just make it available.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the intention of what's there now, although I think the way it's written, it might imply to people that the description text is prescriptive as well. So we probably edit things to make that a little clearer.
That's very much up to the examples. If you give one example with a very concrete error.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So that's all we have to talk about for push. If nobody else has any comments, I can hand it over to Mike.
All right, so Dick and I sort of agree that this should be ready for working group last call, and we would like to get the sense of the room. So before we do that, who has read this or a previous version of the draft?
Then is that a half read?
He read it in a dream.
Okay, that's a small number. We will still have a hum. So 2 hums, 1 in favor, 1 against. Who's in favor of moving this draft to working group last call? Please hum. Anybody against moving this draft to working group last call? Yeah, so small numbers, we still move forward. We will validate it on the list and start working group last call soon after the meeting.
Great, thank you.
Hello, I'm Mike Jones at Microsoft. I'm going to talk about the other delivery draft, which we split off from the common delivery spec and what the status of that is. This is the HTTP-based polling rather than pushing. Next. So what is this? This defines a polling delivery mechanism for sets as opposed to a push one where you can address the endpoint in the push one. This complements the other delivery mechanism, allowing you to set up the connection from either direction. Next. So in Montreal, I talked about what I thought was the status of the poll draft, as well as made a bunch of comments about the push draft. And I'm happy to report that there's been a lot of progress on both since that. As Annabelle just explained to you, the language has been substantially simplified actually in both drafts. There's now the error code IANA registry, which the poll draft now references rather than duplicates. There's some other places where I referenced duplicated language rather than repeated it. And I did a round after Annabelle did the round where I went through my 4-month-old review comments on both drafts and where they were applicable and didn't really change the meaning of any of them. I applied them both. A lot of that was just blocking and tackling, like aligning the language with the already approved set spec. And Annabelle did do a review of that before I updated that. So that's all good progress. Next. So what I didn't do to poll, despite what you might have thought from what I said in Montreal, is I, at least in this round, did not make any breaking changes, but more to discuss. So what's next? I must admit, I frankly ran out of time when doing these edits before the submission thing. I had IIW and FIDO and whatnot. So I still have to do another pass simplifying the language further, do more duplicate elimination, and then we as the working group need to consider addressing what I believe to be some of the remaining semantic oddities in the particular protocol definition. Oddities. They would result in programming odysseys, I suppose. Thank you, Dick. So these two slides are from Montreal. I haven't done anything with them, but I want to re-raise them for your attention. There's places where there's two different parameters that are not handled orthogonally. One sometimes says you should ignore the other, and that doesn't seem like clean protocol definition. So in this next round, I'll take a pass at thinking about how would I do this so that the programming logic does not represent an odyssey. There's also some remaining descriptions of functionality without clear motivation for them that's not actually actionable. So for instance, it says that you may reissue a set, but it doesn't say when or why you would do that or what the recipient should do if that ever occurs. So that either needs to be made clear and actionable or ripped out. And this is a place where I would covet reviewers who could give informed opinions as developers about how would you use this and why. So, sure. Have people reviewed the reissue semantics, and does anybody want to come to the microphone and talk about it? Well, that's pretty resounding. We need people to read that part of the spec. Next. So I'm here with Annabelle reporting that we've made significant progress. Before I heard that we were going to possibly do working group last call, I already wanted to make the point as an editor of both specs that people should get their eyes on the push draft because I think it's mature enough that it could use and withstand broad review. I want people to review the semantics in data structures in the poll draft now. The what does it do and how does it work or not work needs to be reviewed now per some of the previous slides and possibly other oddities that would represent odysseys as we have previously identified. But you know, don't worry your pretty little heads about the language because I'm going to fix that some. If you want to suggest other language, knock yourself out, but that wasn't the primary thrust of where we are with the poll draft. So that's my report.
Can we get anybody who wants to volunteer to sort of review the poll draft? You want to say your name so we can get it in the minutes? For the person taking the minutes?
Go to the mic.
Or, yeah.
I'm Syed Mohammed Sajjad. Syed Mohammed Sajjad from Rafa International University.
Yeah, just show them your badge so we can. Okay, thank you. Anyone else?
That's also apparent, but I will continue to push this over the finish line.
Okay. Is that your last one? Thanks. Pull it over.
I want to use the word odyssey again before I leave. Thank you all.
Here.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
This.
So to get this stuff closed out, I think, Annabelle, there's some tweaks you're going to do for push, some discussion items on subject identifier, and Mike, you've got some work that you've carved up for what you're going to do on poll. Thinking maybe we can have an interim meeting where we could discuss those revisions and see if we can sort of, keep our progress here at velocity so we can wrap these things up. Is there anyone opposed to an interim meeting? We'll post that on the list.
I think we actually owe the room an apology for calling off the last interim meeting. We'll try to be better about it this time. And editors, please let us know if something comes up and we need to postpone. All right. So next on the agenda is new work. So we're getting all three drafts one way or another across the finish line. And the question now is whether there's anything else or we close the working group probably shortly after Prague. So if there's anything big that you can think about that should belong to Secevent, feel free to speak up now or send it to the list or come to Prague equipped with your wonderful new ideas. Otherwise, we'll be done once the three drafts go to IESG. That was short. Ben?
I mean, I was just going to say that, closing the work is like declaring victory. It's not something to feel bad about.
Woohoo!
Yeah.
Okay, any other business anybody has? If not, we'll wrap up our meeting early. Thank you, everybody. Where's the blue sheet? Everyone sign the blue sheet. Anyone not signed the blue sheet, please sign the blue sheet. A blue sheet. There's two blue sheets running around.
No, sorry, I'm the
Pardon?
No, sorry, I'm the
Oh. Thank you for taking notes. Unintended.
Yeah. I'm actually surprised that the subject identifiers that kind of controversial.
Thank you.
Once you start drilling down into semantics and what's an identifier, all that sort of stuff. Never ends.
When do you want to do things? January?
Maybe even late January. Good time after the holidays.
Well, we'll see if I can get these guys to have stuff on this guy.
Yeah.
And then
Okay.
that way that
And then it can
everyone's
be
had
early
time over
January.
the holiday to
Yeah.
read and review. And if we have it mid-January, then there's like the 2 weeks before that.
Okay.
Described for each